morning. This morning's Dharma talk is entitled Viscosity of Spirit, Resistance to Flow. The word viscosity, as you probably know, refers to a substance, a liquid usually, its resistance to flow. For example, maple syrup is more viscous than water. It doesn't flow as readily as water does. And most shampoos are probably more viscous than maple syrup. They resist flowing even more than maple syrup does. And so in the term viscosity refers to liquids usually, and how ready they are to flow or how much they resist to flow. Now, viscosity of spirit deals with resistance also. Resistance is a very interesting area of study and practice. And I encourage everyone to take up the practice of looking at and studying resistance. Resistance will occur. Resistance is not innately or inherently bad, but it can be studied and used in a certain way to maximize freedom in practice of Zen, in the practice of spirituality, if you will. So viscosity of spirit, if I were to try to give a encapsulated definition, I probably can't, but I'll try anyway. In Zen Mind Beginner's Mind, Suzuki Roshi says to live in the realm of Buddha nature is to die as a small being, moment after moment. So viscosity of spirit is resisting this, resisting this kind of death. When we die, in this sense, and let go, we come back to life, fresh and new, with everything. And so this kind of death is actually, it's not the physical death, it's the death to our sense of self, our sense of who we think we are. We let all that go and a brand new creation arises. Viscosity of spirit is resisting that, resisting letting go of our ideas, preferences, likes and dislikes, our sense of self, our unwillingness to let go of those things is the viscosity of spirit. Clinging to our life actually inhibits the full flowering of our life. That's viscosity of spirit. And this can be studied in very practical ways. That's the beauty of resistance and looking at resistance and practicing with it. Long time ago, and shortly after I first came to Zen Center, I was in the Tassajara library reading through transcripts of Trungpa Rinpoche in his just a unpublished transcript of a seminar that he gave at some point. And I came across this question and answer section where the student was complaining about knee pain and how to practice with it, what to do with it. And sitting long periods, like in a sesshin, full weeks intensive sitting, the knees can hurt. They almost guaranteed will hurt. And so this student was bringing up this subject, and Trungpa simply said, "Oh, that is your resistance." That's all. That was his only response to the student. That is your resistance. And when I read that, initially I thought, that's not very compassionate. That's not very kind. I was rather dismissive of that student. And yet, on another level, I was in that stuck with me, and I was intrigued by that. What could he mean by that? That in a long, intensive sitting, the knee pain, that's just a resistance. And so I took that up as a study. And when I would be sitting and I would feel intense sensation in the knees, I would examine it closely. And I would examine the basic way that's recommended to examine it is to try to differentiate the sensation from the attitude towards it. There's the sensation, the physical sensation arising, and then there's this really sucks, the dislike of what's going on. And those are discrete phenomena. They're not the same phenomena. The sensation is one thing, the attitude towards it is another. And just to see clearly the differentiation between the two is the practice. And doing that practice and endeavoring to let go of the critical judgment about this is not a very good thing that's happening, and just staying with the bare sensation, the sensation loses some of its teeth. The sensation loses some of its pain quality, and it's just a very intense sensation, colorful. And Joe Quebec says it can be quite beautiful. It can be really startling that you could be sitting with a very intense sensation thing going on around your lap and not be perturbed by it whatsoever. This, one can stumble upon this kind of experience, and that the resistance to the sensation is more the pain than the sensation itself. And that's an interesting way to look at. That's an interesting laboratory in which to study resistance, the viscosity of spirit that resistance is. And studying in this way, looking closely at what was going on in the sensation, I began to notice there was a contraction of the musculature, an unconscious tightening of the musculature in the lower end of the upper leg, just above the knees, that it's like the muscles themselves, on some cellular level, the muscles were resisting the sensation, pulling away from the sensation. And that didn't help, And I would see that happening, that there was an unconscious tightening of the muscles above the knees. And then I would invite those to relax, and they would unspasm, very subtle, like a spasmodic kind of pulling away from the sensation. And when I would, try to encourage them to relax into the sensation, they would unspasm, and the sensation, or the painful quality of the sensation anyway, would lessen. And so letting go of the resistance to the pain in the knees actually helped. And so that rather curt response of Trungpa's was really insightful for me. I said, well, what does it mean that the pain in the legs is just my resistance? A very practical way to study resistance. And it also points to the fact that resistance can be crude or subtle. We can say, I don't want this. And we're clearly, consciously, resistant to what's going on. But resistance, just the notion that this is who I am, and that it is a form of resistance. Because we're not who we think we are. And yet we resist letting go of subtle preferences, subtle identifications. And so there's a vast territory of study under this one word, resistance. A quick caveat, especially in the Bay Area, I would see people with t-shirts that had the word resist with an exclamation point. on their shirt. And my assumption is that pertains to socio-political concerns where injustice is happening, and resisting the status quo is incumbent upon those who want to strive towards justice. That's a different category of resistance. We're talking about resistance as viscosity of spirit. That's the term that I created, where our actual flowering of our life is inhibited by certain resistances to the way things actually are, which is different from the socio-political need for resistance in times of injustice. My very first practice period at Tassajara, I forget, this was probably 1993, 94. 94, yeah, 1994. We had a big storm, and Tassajara Creek was up to the level of the bathhouse. And parts of the road running through Tassajara was slightly flooded. And sitting in the Zendo, not only was the creek roaring, but you could hear boulders rolling across the bottom of the riverbed. Tremendous storm in 94. First practice period with Mel Weitzman, Sojin Mel Weitzman. He took the Tongariro students. Those are the students new to the monastic practice at Tassajara. He took the Tongariro students into his cabin for tea, just the new students. And he said that you're probably gonna, at some point, feel some deprivation. You come all enthusiastic to do the practice, and that's a wonderful thing, but you're gonna feel some deprivation, and that's okay. You're not gonna be able to choose what to eat, when to get up, and that, your freedom of choice is going to be withheld to a great extent, and you're going to encounter resistance to what's going on. And if you can see the resistance, and if you can let go of the resistance or transcend the resistance, it can release tremendous energy. You can feel energized by the practice, and you will soar through the schedule. And that's very true. In Tassajara, during monastic practice, the first period of zazen is 4:20 in the morning. The wake-up bell rings about a half hour before that. And it can be difficult, it can be hard. And you can feel, I don't want to do this, what's going on here? But the schedule's relentless. And if you want to stay in the monastery, you have to abandon yourself to the schedule. To the extent that you can abandon yourself to the schedule, you indeed feel empowered, energized. And I'm pretty sure that Mel used the expression, you'll soar through the schedule. And that reminded me of a passage in Dogen, the Mountains and Waters Sutra, where he says the following: because mountains are high and broad, the way of riding the clouds always comes from the mountains. The wondrous power of soaring in the wind comes from the mountains. And Tassajara is in the Santa Lucia Mountains, in Swazi's National Forest. It's surrounded by mountains. And when one finally, to some extent, abandons oneself to the schedule, lets go, a feeling of non-separation from one's surroundings occurs. And one feels one with the mountains, one feels, coming into being as the mountains. And a vastness of spirit, a freedom of spirit that comes from the discipline of the schedule when resistance is surmounted. So resistance arising is an opportunity, a wondrous opportunity. Is this an occasion to practice letting go, or is this a wise resistance that needs to be honored? So it's actually fortunate, very fortunate. I think the resistance arises. It can be a gateway. It can open up the realm of practice. As I said, when we let go of the resistance in the monastic context, we feel a sense of non-separation. The way of soaring in the wind comes freely from the mountains. In other words, we feel not separate from the mountains. This sense of separation that comes from self-clinging parts. And there's a feeling of spaciousness and wondrousness and vastness and freshness. And this is called non-duality. Non-duality is very important in Buddhism and in Zen. In the very first part of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Suzuki Roshi says, the most important thing for a Zen student is not to be dualistic. And I guess I'd say the tragic comedic irony is that I feel, rightly or wrongly, I feel that for most people, duality is the order of the day. Non-duality in the context of spiritual practice, especially Eastern spiritual practice, and also Western spiritual practice, is so important. And yet outside of the context of the praxis of spirituality, it's almost an unheard of concept. And so, but resistance and encountering resistance and experimentation with letting go of resistance can open up what this term non-duality actually refers to. And the way of riding the clouds will come from the mountains. The power of soaring, the wondrous, Dogen says, the wondrous power of soaring in the wind comes from the mountains. My assertion here is that this is a poetic expression of the experience of non-duality, where there's no separation. When one abandons oneself to the schedule in the monastic context, one is carried by that schedule into being over and over and over again. Another way of studying resistance is in meditation. Boredom and restlessness. Another thing that Trungpa taught me is, in one context, he said that meditation practice doesn't really begin until you've gone through the gateway of boredom. And that until you become bored with it, you don't know what meditation practice is. That's my commentary on it. Until you actually become bored with the tedium of, it's 5 o'clock or 8 o'clock, time to go sit, to go, geez, again. As long as you're just perpetually excited about sitting on the cushion, you're probably doing it for selfish reasons. You're probably getting some sort of buzz out of settling the body, calming the mind, and it hasn't become boring yet for you. When it becomes boring for you, then you can start to practice. As long as you're getting a cookie from it, you're not encountering the resistance to letting go yet. So, and I feel bored oftentimes while sitting, and when I recognize it, it's an opportunity. I know that I'm in time, or I'm in linear time. I'm thinking about, what I can do when I get off the cushion, or I'm thinking about what happened before I sat. I'm in that linear realm of, someplace else other than here. And I want to get up and do something. There's something better to do, more productive to do than this. And when I recognize that restlessness, that boredom, two sides of one coin, restlessness and boredom, I can endeavor to let go and enter into the timeless dimension of the present. Forget about time, forget about past and future. And it's a very subtle shift of attitude where I'm no longer resisting the plainness of actual zazen. It's just this, it's just traffic sound, it's just the taste of the tea, very, very plain. No psychedelic hallucinogenic transformation into a blissful realm. It's just this right here, right now. When I open up into that, there's a very subtle shift of attitude, a quality of stability and peacefulness and composure and ease can arise. It all pivots on recognizing resistance, not as a problem, but as an opportunity. Thinking, oh, this is good. This is a point of departure from which to let go. Remember Dogen's Sin-Kane, I like to call that Sin-Kane, his 5-verse teaching in Genjo Koan. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. So boredom is a form of the self arising, a preference. I don't want this. I want something else. So you say, oh, there's the preference. There's the resistance. And so there, great. Now I have something I can let go of. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to provide a point of departure from which to let go of the self. Then the third verse, to forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. To forget the self is to come into life now, with the mountains, as the mountains. To soar in the wind, which is given to us from the mountains. To be actualized by the myriad things, to come to life as the Kinnikinnick River, the sound of it. And the other two lines I'm not going to go into right now. The pivotal point is resistance. And studying the Buddha way is to study the arising of the self, often as the viscosity of spirit, the resistance to what's happening. The preference, this is not so good, I want something else. And to contemplate, is that something that can be safely and beneficially let go of? If so, let's give it a try. And if we give it a try, we die to that old self-clinging, and we come to life as this, whatever this is. This is a practical application of the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth is there's dukkha, usually translated as there is suffering. Important to recognize that in the original Pali, the word life does not appear. Sometimes it's mistranslated as life is suffering, but the original is there is suffering. Suffering happens. Dukkha happens. And the word dukkha, suffering, is a rather crude translation. Once again, a sense of dis-ease, a sense of dissatisfaction is inherent in usual human experience. Things are not quite right. Seems to be a pervasive human experience. A lack of ease, a lack of composure. Joko Beck calls it the if-onlys. If only it weren't so hot. If only I got that new car. If only I didn't have to work these hours. You know, if only the mosquitoes weren't there. Things are never quite right. But if only we could adjust it a certain way, then we could relax. Well, that's the sense of dukkha, and we can always find that. And so that's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is the cause of dukkha, and the Sanskrit word is tanha, or another variant is trishna, which etymologically means thirst. So it's sometimes translated as a craving, desire. On a very basic, fundamental level, in Zen, we call it self-clinging. I think that's a very useful, functional understanding of the second noble truth. We cling to a sense of self that is illusory. It's not real. And once again, that oftentimes manifests as some sort of resistance. I don't want to do this. This isn't right. And so we cling to that notion of, we see the way things should be, and it's not that. We cling to our own perspective. And we cling to a sense of self. And then the third noble truth is that with the cessation of this Krishna, this tanha, this self-clinging, there's a cessation of suffering, a cessation of dukkha. When we let go, when we stop clinging to a sense of self, we stop suffering. When we die as a small being, moment after moment, we live in the realm of Buddha nature. Everything is freely, freshly given, a new existence. The generosity of being is astounding and breathtaking when we let go. When we grasp, we got nothing. When we grasp, we got nothing but a clenched fist. But as Dogen says, when we release it, it fills our hand. So the freedom of letting go is wondrous. And the experience of the arising of resistance can be a very practical occasion for exploring the energetic benefit of letting go. The monastic schedule, the monastic practice, there's a metaphorical image for it. It's to put a snake in a bamboo tube. Snakes like to wiggle. That's how they motivate. That's how they move around. They wiggle. Put it in a bamboo tube, it can't wiggle anymore. So the constraints of the monastic discipline withdraw personal choice to a great extent. You just, the bell rings, you go do the next thing. Somebody pops down food in front of you, Zendo, whatever it is, that's what you get to eat. You can't say, can I have item 3 on the menu? No, this is it. And so all of your preferences, all of your desires, all of your wanting to have it your way is, not all, but to a significant extent, is withdrawn. And so you no longer can wiggle in the realm of preferences. And that's bound to bring up the resistance. And that can be a stumbling block or an opportunity. And so the image, a very good image to reflect on, is a snake in a bamboo tube. Now, for a practitioner of Zen, the tube is important. We're not in a monastery, but having a structure of practice to study the self is important. If we're always wiggling, if we're always doing whatever our preferences desire, whatever our impulses desire, there's no context for study. We're just always off, we're not studying. But if we create some kind of bamboo tube to study our behavior, to study our impulses, to study our resistance, then we can practice. So it's really good to have a schedule for practice, a structure for practice. And since you're not living, I don't know if anybody I'm speaking to is living in a monastic context, but mostly you're not. So it's primarily incumbent upon you to create for yourself the structure, the bamboo tube, in which you can encounter and study resistance. It may be sitting every morning before work, having some set time. You've looked at your day, you got a flow chart there of, when you have to be where and what you have to do to prepare, and you figure, okay, if I get up 10 minutes earlier, I can sit for 10 minutes. I can crawl into that bamboo tube for 10 minutes. And then there's your tube, there's your structure, there's your practice container. Some days with enthusiasm, you'll get up, you'll wash your face, and you'll go sit. Some days you'll feel resistance. I could really use 10 minutes more sleep. Or, I got to look at this report that I got to present, and so instead of sitting today, I'm going to go prepare for the meeting. Various things will come up, which you'll feel resistance to the bamboo tube of just, it's 7:35 or whatever time it is, time to sit for 10 minutes. But if you construct your tube well, then you sit and you practice feeling the resistance and transcending it, and possibly stumbling into a more spacious sense of being than the one that's always contained within the press of time. For 10 minutes, you're going to step outside of time. You're going to drop resistance. You're going to drop the to-do list. You're going to drop picking and choosing. That's Chan Master Sensong, the third Chinese ancestor. He says, he said, the great way is without difficulty for those who do not pick and choose. So for 10 minutes, if you don't succumb to resistance, but transcend it by just sitting on your cushion and feeling it, but still sitting on your cushion, there's a possibility you'll stumble upon the great way. You'll stumble upon that space that is free of picking and choosing, that space that is free of self-clinging. As long as we cling to self, we suffer, grossly or subtly. If we make some effort to let go, we may stumble upon a spaciousness where suffering diminishes. I think he was Cambodian, Ajahn Chah, Venerable Ajahn Chah. One of his famous saying is something about practicing letting go, and he says, if you let go a little, you'll have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you'll have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will know a complete peace and freedom, something like that. So Zazen fundamentally is letting go. Shamatha, calming the body, calming the mind, insight into impermanence, all of that is kind of secondary to the fundamental practice of letting go, of living in the realm of Buddha nature by dying as a separate self, moment after moment. So it's good to have a bamboo tube so that you can it's a thought that I lost. I was going to include in that, and I don't remember what it was. It's good to have a bamboo tube, to have some structure of practice, some way of encountering self-clinging. In order to encounter self-clinging, you have to kind of like step back from acting it out to see, you know, if you act on your impulse, you don't see it as an impulse. But when you see the impulse, when you don't act, you have an occasion to see the impulse as an impulse. But if the impulse arises and you immediately go for it, you are nothing but the impulse. Therefore, you have no way to see the impulse. But if you have a structure of practice where you can actually study the self, take a backward step that illuminates self-clinging, then you can experiment with letting go. Let go a little, see what that brings. That feels good, let go a lot, see what that brings. Yeah. So the fundamental thing I want to impart this morning is that resistance is good when you see it, because that's a choice point. You know, is this an occasion where I can experiment with not being that person, letting go of that person, and see what comes up when I forget that person? But you can't forget that person until you see that person. If you're always acting on impulse, you don't see the person because you're embedded in the behavior. So have a practice structure. You know, ideally sitting a bit every day. Morning is best. Doesn't have to be a huge chunk of time. The consistency is more important than quantity. You know, making your coffee, which I'm doing now, making your coffee, and instead of checking out the latest YouTube videos on Facebook, take your coffee onto your cushion, sit on your cushion and drink your coffee. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then, you know, whatever else you have to do before you go out the door. You know, doing that a little bit with rigorous consistency every day is a great bamboo tube. It's not a bamboo tube if you sit when you want to and you don't sit when you don't. That's just another way of wiggling. You're still wiggling. But whether you want to or not, it's time to sit. Then you're studying resistance. And you can't drop resistance unless you study it. You can't let go of resistance unless you feel it. So it's great when you don't want to sit, if you sit. In fact, when you sit when you don't want to sit, that's probably more fruitful than sitting when you want to sit. I take the word probably out of it. Sitting when you don't want to sit is more fruitful than sitting when you want to sit. That's the nature of the bamboo tube. To study the Buddha way is to study the self, especially when it arises as resistance. To study the self is to forget the self. If you see the resistance, you can let go of it. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. Fresh, new life. New person. The old person died, so Buddha is born as you. So the field of resistance is a bountiful field of practice. Don't be jerked around by your preferences. Build your bamboo tube today. Okay?